everybody once again to AIOC 2021, the 79th virtual conference. I am your hall coordinator, Himay, and your MC as well. So I would like to once again welcome Dr. Santosh Honawar. Dr. Santosh, the virtual space is all yours. And as per your permission given, we will first play the keynote, which is by Dr. George Alio. And अनूप जी क्या आप एवी प्ले कर सकते हैं प्लीज.
Hello, I'm Jorge Leon. I want to thank the All India Ophthalmological Society to be invited to this wonderful congress. The topic of my presentation will be the outcomes of corneal graft surgery in 2021, whether they are still a problem. I have no financial disclosures related to the topic of this presentation. We know that there has been a continuous growth in the volume of surgical corneal transplantation. We have focused our interest in Spain, our country, in which from 2001 to 2016, 90,494 corneal transplants were performed according to the Organización Nacional de Trasplantes in 2018. Obviously, there is a progressive aging of the Spanish population, which is leading to more indications, and indeed the introduction of new modalities of corneal transplantation, such as anterior-posterior corneal laminar grafts, induce more and new indications. There is an extensive bibliography seeking the visual outcomes of corneal transplantation and risk factors affecting graft survival. However, the literature is scarce in defining the different causes of graft failure in each type of corneal transplant. The types of corneal failure should be considered in two types. One is the anatomical failure, which is a decrease in graft transparency, which is to be considered as a failure of the tissue. Second, we have a potential functional failure in which we get inadequate visual outcome. This is a failure of the outcome. The main questions in modern corneal graft surgery are the following. First, which are the current anatomical outcomes of corneal graft surgery? Whether the modern techniques that have emerged in the last years are improving such outcomes. What is the failure rate of the different modern corneal graft surgery? And which are the main causes of modern corneal graft failures? We have in Ophthalred a multicentrical national collaborative network for clinical research in Spain, sponsored by the Spanish government. And we performed a large retrospective 10 years multicenter study. We performed the study in the main centers of the national network of clinical research, aiming to identify the causes of failure of the different corneal graft techniques: penetrating keratoplasty, deep anterior laminar keratoplasty, DSEK, and DMEK. We have published all this information in this interesting and important paper in 2021, in which we will see most of the contents of this talk. Which were the indications for corneal grafts? As you see, the indications for PKP were bullous keratopathy and endothelial dystrophy, keratitis, leucoma, and trauma as the main indications. In deep anterior laminar graft was keratoconus, herpetic keratitis, and stromal dystrophies. And in DSEK and DMEK, endothelial dystrophy and bullous keratopathy were the main indications. Penetrating keratoplasty is still the most frequently performed corneal graft in Spain. The main indications for surgery, as you have already heard, were bullous keratopathy, followed by the presence of endothelial dystrophy, leucoma, and keratitis complications. Consider with an overall positive prognosis in general, in the long term, but survival rate at 5 years varies ranging from 63.7% to 83%. Not that successful, as you can see. In deep anterior laminar graft, the main surgical indication was keratoconus and corneal ectasia, followed by herpetic keratitis. When surgically successful, it is a safer corneal transplantation procedure. So the best long-term anatomical survival rates from 85% to 98% at 5 years. And this could be explained by lower risk of immunization compared to penetrating keratoplasty. This is mainly due to the absence of endothelial reaction. Its surgical indications are performed for keratoconus and corneal ectasia, which were 64.3% of the eyes, and patients are mostly younger with less ocular comorbidity that can lead to complications. The outcomes of modern keratoplasty for DMEK and DSEK were endothelial dystrophy in 58.3% and bullous keratopathy in 30.6%. The anatomical survival rates were from 79.4 to 96%, and it has been reported that endothelial keratoplasty survival increases over time along with surgeon-centered experience. Which were the causes of the failures of keratoplasty that we observed in our study? The main causes were primary graft failure, immunological rejection, and non-rejection cause. Primary graft failure is indeed the one that happens when the corneal edema happens from the first postoperative day and transparently never recovers. Immunological rejection, on the contrary, is when an immune reaction happens, causing graft decompensation from a previously successful graft and transparent. And non-rejection, indeed, those that are not classified in the previous categories, like endothelial decompensation without rejection, glaucoma with high intraocular pressure, diseases of the ocular surface, recurrence of the primary disease, wound adhesions, hypertonia, and trauma. The causes of failure are listed here. In primary penetrating keratoplasty, the main reason was immune rejection, followed by late endothelial failure, glaucoma, and ocular surface disease in general. Penetrating keratoplasty reoperations were affected by the same causes and with a higher participation of ocular surface problems. In deep anterior laminar graft, the main causes of failure were the problems related to the disease and glaucoma. Indeed, it is an important problem, ocular surface disorder in these cases, as far as they were the first reason of failure. In the SEC and the MEC, it was immune rejection, followed by primary failure. It's clear, as you see in the bars, that immune rejection was less frequent in the MEC, and glaucoma also was less frequent in the MEC. Penetrating keratoplasty failure, indeed, has been one of the reasons of concern of surgeons for many years. There are many studies that have shown that it's multifactorial and it's a progressive process. The underlying mechanism, even that we have studied a lot, is not completely understood, especially the one that happens in late failures. The endothelial failure is considered to be the major one and could be acute with endothelial failure due to immune rejection in the early stage, or chronic, in which endothelial failure is caused by a progressive cell decline long-term over 10 years following penetrating keratoplasty is observed, even without evident rejection or evidence of intraocular inflammation. Deep anterior laminar graft failures mainly happens due to ocular surface disease, like limbal stem cell deficiency, infectious keratitis, keratolysis or persistent epithelial defect, and herpetic eye disease and glaucoma. DMEC DSEC failures have as the main reason endothelial decompensation without rejection, which happened to be in 31.9% of the failures. Primary graft failure was the main reason of failure in the MEC population, with occupying 64.1% of the failures. The majority of failures in the MEC, 77%, and DSEC, 51%, happened in the first year after the surgery. It is obvious that learning curve is happening in this series of cases as far as it was included in the centers that were affected by this study. In other words, the learning curve is affecting the outcomes probably and reflects the real world when you start this technique in any hospital. So we need strategies for failed grafts. First, we need to address immunological problems and ocular surface problems and glaucoma, as far as they are the main reasons of failure in penetrating keratoplasty. The second, they make a novel therapeutic strategies for failed penetrating keratoplasty grafts and have a potential superiority when compared with repeated PRK. But remember, they have a learning curve until satisfactory results are obtained. In summary, the question of this presentation is, are the outcomes of corneal graft surgery in 2021 still a problem? The answer is yes, they are. We need to optimize the anatomical outcome of modern corneal transplantation techniques. The main reasons for failure in general are immune rejection, ocular surface inflammation and dry eye disease, and glaucoma. And there is a need to look for new solutions based on modern approaches such as advanced therapies and stem cell corneal regeneration. If you want to go further into this topic, this is one general review that we have done in this paper published in British Journal of Ophthalmology in 2021. This is a paper in which we have the outcomes of the multicentric study of the causes of corneal transplantation failure in Spain, published also in 2021 in Acta Ophthalmologica. There's another paper, European Journal of Ophthalmology, in which you have the corneal graft surgery, a monocentric long-term analysis, in which you can see what is the coincidence of the multicentric analysis with the monocentric analysis, what means that what we obtained in the multicentric study is essentially what you should expect to have in your center as far as you have expert and talented corneal surgeons. Finally, I would like to remember to you that we have this online course on refractive corneal lens surgery as an international university specialization course. All of you are invited to join this course, which includes 500 hours of teaching multimedia material, fully in English, and with a lot of information that you will find very interesting in the medical education in ophthalmology in these specific areas of specialization. And thank you very much for your very kind attention.
Right, sir. So that was all from the keynote. And Dr. Santosh, you can take over, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I welcome all the viewers for our virtual course on conjunctival tumors. And we have 4 speakers today. The first one is Dr. Vikas Menon, who is faculty at Arvind Eye Hospital, Chennai. And he's an oculoplasty surgeon with special interest in ocular oncology. I would invite him to speak on pigmented conjunctivitis. Because all yours.
Thank you, sir. So the screen is visible.
Yes, Vikas.
Thank you. So I'll be first talking about the pigmented tumors. Broadly speaking, whenever we are talking about tumors of the ocular surface, we are talking about commonly epithelial tumors. There are stromal tumors, but those will be covered by the next speaker. Now, when we talk about epithelial tumors of the ocular surface, there can be 2 types that we consider based on the color of the tumor at presentation. One is the pigmented tumors, those we call as melanocytic, and the others which are non-pigmented or non-melanocytic types. Here I am talking about melanocytic tumors today. Now, melanocytic tumors of conjunctiva actually arise from melanocytes which are located near the basal cells of epithelium. And the common types of melanocytic tumors that we see are nevi, racial melanosis, primary acquired melanosis, and melanoma on the surface arising from the surface of conjunctiva. Now let's go on and see how each one of these present and differentiate clinically from each other. So this is probably one of the most common types of pigmentation that we see on conjunctiva in our country. Here you see a patient with a diffuse bilateral irregular patchy type of pigmentation, more concentrated around the limbus if you notice carefully, and then gradually spreading around till the fornices, confined to the palpebral aperture, the exposed areas, and not reaching up to the fornices. Now this is most of the times present bilaterally. And so what they have here is a complexion associated melanosis, which used to be earlier called as racial melanosis. This is very common in our country. So if a patient presents with bilateral irregular diffuse pigmentation, which is usually present since childhood or gives a long history, what you're dealing with is a complexion associated melanosis. Next, most common type of pigmented lesion that we see on the eye surface is this. What is this? You see here, it's a relatively well-defined patch of pigmentation on the conjunctiva, on the bulbar conjunctiva in the interpalpebral fissure located near the limbus. And if you see these lesions on the slit lamp, you may notice that they have slight thickness to them. And also, if you notice more carefully, you will see that they have these tiny microcysts which may be there in 60% of these lesions. And once you see these microcysts in the lesion, then you can be reasonably certain that what you are seeing is a conjunctival nevus, which is mostly benign. Sometimes these pigmented lesions or nevi also may appear slightly darkish and associated with some feeder vessels or some reddishness. And usually, since these lesions are seen in childhood, and the parents will come worried that the pigmentation has increased and the redness has increased, and you excise these lesions for the purpose of ruling out an underlying melanoma, and what the pathologist tells you that it is nothing but some inflammation over added to the nevus. Now, this can be associated with the papillae formation on the upper tarsal conjunctiva as well in such situations where there is inflammation. And if you give a course of topical steroids, sometimes the inflammation goes down also. Nevi typically are located in the bulbar conjunctiva, as I mentioned, most commonly near the limbus, but you may also have nevi located on the plica or sometimes even on the caruncle. These nevi usually remain stable for a long time, but they can also grow in size and increase in vascularity as the child grows near puberty or sometimes in pregnancy also. These nevi may grow and may grow some sort of vascularity, but nothing to be afraid of. Nevi can also be amelanotic, which is less common in our country, but yes, at times you may see a patient who's got a slightly reddish or pinkish patch near the limbus with some feeder vessels. But if you notice carefully, you may see at times these typical microcysts within the lesion, and that will help you to characterize the lesion as a nevus. And if you excise them and send it for pathology, this may become out as an amelanotic nevus, which is rarely seen in our country. These nevi have less than 1% chance of conversion into a malignancy. Now, when do you suspect malignant transformation in a nevus? If the nevus onset occurs in adulthood, if there is a history of recent growth or color change happening in an adult who has had a nevus for all his life, if the location is other than the typical locations that I just mentioned, maybe it's in the fornices or on the tarsal conjunctiva, you see something like a pigmented patch, then you may suspect malignant transformation in those nevi more often. If they have very prominent feeder vessels, much more prominent and deeper and bigger than what I just showed. If you excise the nevus properly with clear margins, and again there is a recurrence after excision, then again you should suspect that there could be a possible malignant transformation of nevus, and in all such cases you need to treat these cases. Some systemic associations which one should know of when seeing nevi, the Carney complex, which may be associated with myxomas, and dysplastic nevus syndrome, which is actually a kind of a pre-malignant association. The next most common type of pigmentation that we see on the ocular surface is this. It's an irregular kind of pigmentation, not brownish, but slightly a grayish blue type of irregular type of pigmentation. Now, what is the difference here is that if you notice carefully that all the conjunctival vessels you can see overlying, and if you make a thin slit of the slit lamp of the light, then you will see that the pigmentation actually is not conjunctival but subconjunctival, arising from the sclera and the episcleral tissues. That is why the color is slightly different. It's more grayish or bluish rather than brown pigment that you see in conjunctival pigmentation. Now, this is called as melanocytosis. There can be various degrees of the spread of this pigmentation on the sclera. But what is important here is look at the eyelids also, and sometimes you will see that the eyelid skin is also pigmented along with the episcleral tissues. In such situations, it is called as oculodermal melanocytosis or nevus of Vota. Now, why this is important to take note of is because these patients have almost 1 in 400 chance of having uveal melanomas, and that is why you need to keep these patients under regular follow-ups. You also need to look at their palates, because if there is a palatal pigmentation, then these patients are at more risk for esophageal melanoma, and you look for hairline pigmentation because those cases may even have a meningeal melanoma. Moving on to the next very important type of pigmentation, this is primary acquired melanosis. Primary acquired melanosis is nothing but acquired melanosis which occurs later on in adult life, which is not associated with any predisposing ocular condition or disease or any other type of secondary cause of pigmentation. It just appears on its own and maybe diffuse, irregular kind of brown pigmentation on the ocular surface with ill-defined margins. Sometimes the patient will give history that it has become smaller or it has grown big again. Now, these are all cases of acquired melanosis, primary acquired melanosis. Nowadays, the term is shifted to CMIN or conjunctival melanocytic intraepithelial neoplasia. Now, these lesions can appear anywhere on the bulbar surface, even on the tarsal conjunctival surface, palpebral conjunctival surface. They may be unifocal or multifocal also. So you need to evaluate the ocular surface properly and need to mark these on a good diagram or take good photographs for a serial observation if you plan to observe these lesions. Primary acquired melanosis is a clinical term, and the conjunctival melanocytic intraepithelial neoplasia is the term used preferred on histopathology, which excludes those cases where there is just a a proliferation of melanin pigment without actual true proliferation of melanocytes. So in CMIN, which is actually a more specific term, that is preferred nowadays over PAM. There's also a detailed classification of and scoring of these CMIN lesions for people who are interested to go into more details. But on an average, what we need to understand is that these patients may have up to 46% chance of conversion to melanoma if they have atypical cells, or they are called CMIN or PAM with atypia. There may be PAM lesions which don't have any atypia. So those are safe, and those cases may not have any risk of conversion to melanoma. But PAM with atypia is definitely significant. So this is an example of secondary acquired melanosis patient on anti-glaucoma medications for a long time. Sometimes you look into their fornices and they will have some pigmentation, but there will always be a history of long-term use of some sort of a medication. Next is the dreaded thing, that is conjunctival melanoma, which is the most dangerous kind of conjunctival pigmented lesion. Most of these cases are associated with PAM. Up to 75% of melanoma lesions arise on a background of PAM. 20% arise on a background of a conjunctival nevus, and almost 5% arise de novo. There are some known risk factors like dysplastic nevus syndrome, neurofibromatosis, xeroderma patients. They have slightly more chances of developing conjunctival melanoma. And recently, what has been discovered is BRAF mutation, which has been associated with conjunctival melanoma. Now, this is an example of a patient presenting with a thick nodular type of mass on the conjunctiva with a deeply pigmented component. Now, this seems to be a melanoma which has probably arisen from a long-standing conjunctival nevus. Another patient who presented with diffuse deep dark pigmentation of the fornices, the bulbar conjunctiva, pigmentation spilling over on and involving the lid margin, as well with a thick, large nodule in the superior fornix. Now, this is the type of conjunctival melanoma that you see, which has arisen from a background of PAM, or primary acquired melanosis. Another patient who has diffuse deep pigmentation of the fornix, inferior fornix, and a variable kind of pigmentation on the bulbar conjunctiva. The pigmentation is spilling onto the lid margin. You see nodules here and a nodular component here, thickening here, spreading into the upper lid also. Again, this is an example of a conjunctival melanoma which arose from a long-standing PAM. Now, that is why the PAM lesions are very significant and should not be ignored when you see them. At least keep them under regular follow-up or observation. Or if you see any of the danger signs, then you need to treat them. The indications of treatment will be discussed subsequently in the talk on the management of these lesions. Now, conjunctival melanomas are deadly tumors with almost 9 to 25% chance of systemic metastasis and almost 40% chance of regional lymph node metastasis. The common sites of metastasis are liver, lung, GIT, CNS, skin, and bones. And there is a full AJCC classification by which you can classify these melanoma lesions into TNM staging. So, based on whether in the eye it is confined to the bulbar conjunctiva or involving palpebral conjunctiva, or there is local invasion into the globe, eyelid, or orbit, or there is an extraocular invasion. Then the regional lymph node status is taken into account and distant metastasis taken into account. So all these patients should be staged as per the latest AJCC classification also. So there is a significant 13 to 38% risk of melanoma related mortality at 10 years. And this is Western data. I believe that in India, probably the mortality would be much higher because these patients present much later to us. It's better that earlier these cases are picked up and some sort of treatment given. Better is the ultimate survival, long-term survival. Now, moving on to just a few examples of some other situations which may mimic conjunctival melanoma. Now, this young patient presented with a diffuse blackish pigmentation on the conjunctival surface. And now the only significant thing here was this was an acquired pigmentation, very deeply pigmented. You see the history, there was a history of PIA surgery. So this was a rare situation where actually the port was left slightly open and there was pigment leakage from the choroid, which was getting deposited under the conjunctiva and which scared the patient as to what is this black pigmented thing on my eye. And so the VIA surgeon went back in again, closed the ports tightly, and most of this pigmentation could be simply washed off. There are some other situations which you need to be aware of. Sometimes there is an OSSN. Dr. Fairuz will be talking about more about OSSNs and non-pigmented tumors, but these non-pigmented OSSNs at times in India may have a layer of pigmentation over them, or these cells may be slightly more deeply pigmented than usual OSSN lesions. And these pigmented OSSNs are often confused as melanomas. But the only thing is that the prognosis is much better if the patient has a OSSN rather than a melanoma. So it's good for the patient if it turns out to be OSSN. Then sometimes we have these ciliary staphylomas actually, which are referred to us as cases of conjunctival melanoma. But if you look carefully, you will see a normal looking conjunctiva overlying, but you will see that the pigmentation is coming from subconjunctival area from the ciliary body. And this is thinned out sclera, and what you are seeing here is the scleral, is the choroidal hue or the choroidal pigmentation through the thinned out sclera. Rarely, you may also have a uveal melanoma, which is spread out through the sclera, which also may appear similarly at times, and you will see choroidal pigmentation under the conjunctiva that may also mimic a conjunctival melanoma to somebody who has a superficial look at the lesion. So in all these cases, a proper thorough examination and an awareness of pre-malignant conditions like primary acquired melanosis is very important. These cases often go missed in a routine OPD practice. So I end my topic here. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next non-melanocytic tumors. Thank you.
Thank you, because it was very, very nice. Extensive collection of pictures, beautifully covered. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
I have Dr. Fairuz PM from Horus Eye Care, Bangalore, and Prabha Eye Clinic, Bangalore, talking to us on stromal conjunctival, non-pigmented conjunctival tumors.
Thank you very much, sir. On the outset, I thank Dr. Santosh Unnava, my mentor, for this opportunity to be part of this instruction course. And greetings to all the viewers today. I will be talking on the non-melanocytic tumors of ocular surface, and I'm Fairuz. I have no financial disclosures or interest. So Dr. Vikas Menon has covered a series in spectrum of pigmented lesion, what you see, which is like completely pigmented on your right side and partially pigmented on your left side. And what we are going to discuss is about the lesions such as in the center. So most of these lesions, when we talk about ocular surface lesions, we make a lot of diagnosis depending upon the colors, whether it's brown, whether it is white, yellow, orange. So there are a spectrum of tumors where you can actually diagnose accurately looking into the colors. So the objective of today's presentation of mine is basically clinical diagnosis and differentiating features. Non-melanocytic tumors, again, are classified as benign and malignant. I will try to cover as much as possible in the limited time, the spectrum of tumors, basically case series based. So most important is to differentiate these tumors, differentiate between benign versus malignant tumors. So starting from the presentation to the clinical features, we have to differentiate the malignant lesions from the benign or even infective and inflammatory lesions. So what you see in your left side here are all benign lesions, and what you see on your right side are the malignant lesions. So there are very striking difference between these two, and the most important that you see here is the vascularity of the lesion, the large feeder vessels, the elevation, the thickness of the lesion, and exactly that is what we are going to speak about today. So going on to lesions which is almost transparent, there is not much color over here. This 72-year-old gentleman who has a history of gradually progressing mass was referred to rule out a conjunctival tumor. Well, as you can see here, it's very transparent, but probably because of the overlying, the vessels, the referral doctor was worried about a malignancy in his eye. He has got history of multiple surgical procedures done in the conjunctiva, and this was one test which was done in the clinics, the transillumination test. It was positive, and this is an inclusion cyst arising from the conjunctival epithelium. This lady presented with this lesion, as you can see here, again kind of transparent, and this is the left eye where it's very, very cystic as well. She has another lesion which is a little bit fleshy in the right eye as well, with scattered pigmentation on the surface. This is in fact a case of a balloon cystic nevus. Yes, nevus can present cystic cystic and transparent as well. When such a case presents in the clinic, which is quite rare, very transparent, which is kind of bullous, almost looking like a chemosis, there are two things that we would keep in mind. One is a conjunctival myxoma, and this is a very rare tumor, a conjunctival stromal tumor, which is very transparent and cystic. In fact, these tumors have to be taken seriously because they can be systemic association. A systemic evaluation is very, very important, although these tumors are quite rare. Now, going from transparent without color to colors, now here we have a lesion where there are three colors. In the center, you have something which is kind of transparent. Then temporarily, you have a reddish lesion and a violaceous lesion, which is, present in the caruncle. So you have a lesion with varying colors, and this usually is a lesion which is bleeding. As you can see here, the blood vessels and the blood. So this is how a veno-lymphatic malformation can present. Usually they present in the orbit. It can also present in the conjunctiva. So going on to reddish lesions now, a very well-defined red lesion in the conjunctiva. This is a capillary hemangioma. Very red, violaceous lesion, bullous in appearance. So this can also happen over the conjunctiva. This is a patient who has undergone multiple surgeries. You can see scarring of the conjunctiva over here with recurrent, bleeding and reddish lesion of the conjunctiva. And it was diagnosed to be an arteriovenous malformation after confirmation with digital subtraction angiography with connection to the cavernous sinus. And in fact, she was treated with injection bleomycin. Now, this is a very common reddish lesion that you see in your practice, very well defined. This patient has undergone an excision biopsy elsewhere for ocular surface squamous neoplasia, referred to rule out ocular surface squamous neoplasia recurrence. And this happened within 2 weeks after the surgical excision of OSSN. So it's very, very unlikely to have a recurrence within 2 weeks after excision. And this was in fact a surgical site pyogenic granuloma, which is very, very red in color. And now a similar lesion that I'm going to show you here is again in the bulbar conjunctiva, far away from the limbus, which is kind of very papillary. You can see irregular surface, papillary fronds, more vascular, and this was a conjunctival papilloma in an immunocompromised patient. Now, the difference between, the pyogenic granuloma and conjunctival papilloma here, it's more of an inflammatory with diffuse inflammation, redness, and even discharge, which can rule out a pyogenic granuloma and differentiate it from a conjunctival papilloma. All right, so lesions can present with hemorrhage also, even neoplasia. 35-year-old lady with subconjunctival hemorrhage in the left eye for the past 2 months. So whenever you find a lesion, there is an orangish lesion also associated with it. So whenever you have a lesion where there is repeated or recurrent hemorrhages, there are three things that we would think of. One is veno-lymphatic malformation, amyloidosis, and very rarely a Kaposi sarcoma in immunocompromised patients. And this turned out to be amyloidosis, a primary localized conjunctival amyloidosis. So these have to be kept in mind. So whenever you see these reddish lesions in pediatric patients, although, malignancy and in pediatric ocular surface tumors is quite rare, but keep in mind leukemia and liposarcoma, which is quite rare, can happen in pediatric age group with this reddish appearing lesion in the conjunctiva, and not to miss rhabdomyosarcoma. Although it's a very common malignancy in the orbit, it can have a conjunctival component as well. Now we're going to the whitish lesions. This looks very, very pearly white. All right, a pearly white lesion sitting in the lower tarsal conjunctiva. In fact, this came out to be a keratin cyst in the left eye, lower lid. She in fact presented like an eyelid swelling. So it's always good to avert the eyelid, whether it is the lower eyelid or the upper eyelid, because the lesion might be sitting in the tarsal conjunctiva. In fact, the differential diagnosis and the referral was to rule out sebaceous gland carcinoma. But you know what? There is not very classical dilated vessels, and it's very, very pearly white, and it turned out to be a keratin cyst. Now, going on to other whitish lesions, a 2-year-old child with a spot in the eye since birth. Apart from the white colored lesions in the corneal component, you find it kind of brown, and the dermal appendages are present over the surface. And it's a very common lesion that we usually see in children, and this is a limbal dermoid. Now, going ahead more, this this is a 30-year-old lady who presented with eyelid swelling and fleshy mass that she has noticed in both the eyes since childhood, and it has been progressing. And this is what we found, multiple lesions in the right eye and a lower pharyngeal lesions, which is more of yellowish in color and also whitish because again of the dermal component. And this was a dermolipoma, multifocal in both the eyes. Classically, dermolipoma presents in the superolateral bulbar conjunctiva as very, very yellowish lesion. And most of the time, it is cosmesis that the patient is worried about. With careful excision, in fact, the treatment is attained. Now, older patients, he was referred for a mass in the left eye with recent onset. And well, so this is the lesion when he presented to us. In fact, bilateral more in the left eye. And he had this CT scan with him before he came to us because they suspected a tumor in the orbit. And it is a very classical case of orbital fat prolapse in an elderly individual. Again, excision biopsy is the treatment of choice. Now, this patient again was referred as a case of orbital fat prolapse. So she has this lesion which is coming from the supratemporal area of the right eye as well as from the left eye. But it really doesn't look like an orbital fat prolapse. You saw those lesions. Orbital fat prolapse or dermolipomas are usually yellow in color. This is more of orangish. This is a very classical salmon colored appearance. And more than that, there is this dilated feeder vessel which is seen over that. And that was the right eye and there's the left eye. In fact, this was a conjunctival lymphoma that was clinically diagnosed, further evaluated with CT scan. It was a muscle lymphoma involving the lateral rectus muscle. Incision biopsy done, which was proven to be extramarginal zone low-grade lymphoma. Systemic evaluation done. So conjunctival lymphoma is a malignancy of the ocular surface. Systemic metastasis rates are associated with conjunctival lymphoma as well, which is 20%. So systemic evaluation is very, very important. And the risk factors or the prognostic indicators are multifocality, bilaterality, and involving the fornix and the palpebra. This is a patient, as you can see here, treated for ocular surface disorder, dry eye, diffuse congestion for the past 1 year, on lubricants, on and off steroids. But what you see closer, when you look a closer look, are these again salmon colorish tiny lesions sitting in the nasal and the temporal bulbar conjunctiva in both the eyes. And this also came out to be a malt lymphoma. So any salmon colorish or an orangish colorish lesion, it could be a lymphoma, which has always to be ruled out. I'm not going into the details of the classification here, but you need to know conjunctival and orbital lymphoma falls under the T1 and T2 AJCC TNM classification. And depending upon the systemic involvement, again, it is staged under Ann Arbor classification. A 70-year-old gentleman with a whitish lesion again for the past 4 months. Well, it is more than white. You can see a lot of feeder vessels going on to the lesion, and there is rose Bengal positivity in the clinical evaluation and with this perilimbal lesion. So this is a classical presentation of ocular surface squamous neoplasia, especially in older individual it presents. So this is a spectrum of, ocular surface tumors, neoplasia, starting from dysplasia, carcinoma in situ to squamous cell carcinoma. So OSSN actually mimics a benign, or inflammatory lesion, and most common mimic is a pterygium or a pingicula, and it is very, very important to identify and differentiate both. As you see here in a pingicula, the vessels are there, but it is with very tiny caliber and it is very straight, whereas in an OSSN, as you can see here, the vessels are more tortuous and they are more thick as a feeder vessel with the presence of abundant keratin on the surface. So it's very, very important to identify this. Conjunctival SCC, why is it so important? I'm going to talk to you in a little bit in more detail than the other lesions because it's most common conjunctival malignancy. Although it is low grade, it can be aggressive with systemic involvement, and we have other histopathological aggressive variants like mucoepidermoid, spindle cell, and adeno. The classical characteristic clinical features of ocular surface squamous neoplasia is that it is in the perilimbal location because of the etiology, the zone, and the presence of keratin, rose Bengal staining, feeder vessels, intrinsic vessels, corneal encroachment, as you can see here, and scleral fixity. Scleral fixity is something that we actually evaluate in a clinic. We take a cotton bud tip applicator after anesthetizing the ocular surface. We try to move it and rule out scleral fixity. In fact, regional lymph nodes, including the preauricular, the submandibular, and cervical lymph nodes, should also be ruled out. The risk factors, apart from immunosuppression, xeroderma pigmentosum, apart from UVB rays, it can be immunosuppression and xeroderma pigmentosum. In these situations, the patients can present much younger, much aggressive. It can be multifocal and it can be bilateral, as in this case. So this is again an OSSN without any surface keratin. So this is the papillary variant of OSSN, which is very, very papillomatous, but you can see this classical feeder vessels going to the lesion. Again, a very small lesion, which is quite nodular. This is a mucoepidermoid variant of an OSSN, which is quite aggressive. It can solely present as a corneal lesion, as in this case, where it is confirmed with an ASOCT, where you can actually see a pouting over here in the ASOCT of the abnormal epithelium into the normal epithelium. And this is a corneal OSSN. There can be presentations such as this. This is an immunocompromised patient with a diffuse corneal OSSN. So apart from the conjunctiva, even cornea can be affected in OSSN. It can present as necrotizing scleritis, as in this case. And as Dr. Vikas Menon already pointed out, in our population, we know we are all brown skinned, and we can have OSSN presenting with pigment, like a pigmented OSSN, as in this case. So clinical documentation is very, very important, be it whatever lesion, to reach into an accurate diagnosis for better management of this lesion. This is exactly how we document our patients. That is clinical. Ultrasound B-scan is indicated. Other investigative modalities, if you're suspecting intraocular extension in larger lesions, orbital imaging in those lesions where you're suspecting intraorbital extension. Now, this is a patient who presented with this tiny fleshy lesion in the caruncle. I'll just take you through a few caruncular lesion. In fact, she was bothered. She was a pharmacist, very much aware of, the medical part of diseases and stuff. So she was very, very worried about the small lesions, which has been rapidly growing. And this came out to be an oncocytoma, which is a very rare tumor, but systemic evaluation is very important, and there can be recurrences in these lesions. Again, caruncle is an area where you have dermis, you have appendages, you have hair follicles, you have all the glands, the sebaceous glands, the sweat glands. So there are many tumors that can arise from the caruncle, and this is a sebaceous gland hyperplasia. You have to rule it out from a very lethal malignancy, the sebaceous gland carcinoma, where you will find this very reddish lesion. It can be vascular, there can be ulceration, there'll be fever. So this is a sebaceous gland carcinoma. A 60-year-old lady with reddish mass, acute onset. She was posted for surgery suspecting lymphoma. It is cystic. We did an ultrasound. It came out to be a myocystic sarcosis. After treatment, it regressed. And this is a diffuse involvement of the conjunctiva. I have to mention this. This is a intraepithelial variant of sebaceous gland carcinoma, which you have to keep in mind. So it is a clinically wide spectrum of lesion, be it melanocytic or amelanocytic. Colors definitely helps. And appropriate clinical diagnosis is very, very essential for further management. And Dr. Santosh Unavar is going to take us through the management. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very nice talk as usual. I'll start with and on time for the first time.
Don't pull my legs. Thank you so much.
You have some responsibility now since you're a member of the scientific.
Yes, and Hime wouldn't let me present.
Correct.
Even a second more.
Right. So I'll go ahead with my talk and this current management of ocular surface tumors. So I'll talk a little bit about the current advances in diagnosis. Of course, it's a clinical diagnosis. Tumors are staring at you, begging for a diagnosis, so you really don't have to do much. But there are situations where there might be issues with the diagnosis where you can actually do imaging. Then we'll talk about topical treatment, surgical management, radiation, and target therapy. So let's start with imaging. My slides are not moving. Okay. Are my slides moving? Yeah?
Yes, it is.
Okay, fine. All right. So let's, so for example, if these are 4 patients that you have all with pigmented lesion, you go by a set of clinical criteria, that is interpalpable location, variable pigmentation, absence of corneal epithelial invasion, no episcleral fixation, no intrinsic vascularity, and microcyst. But if you have any doubt at all, then you can do anterior segment OCT or UBM, where you can see small cysts, which are called microcysts, and larger coalescent cysts called macrocysts, which confirms the diagnosis. So if you have a pigmented or a non-pigmented conjunctival lesion where you want to diagnose a melanotic or amelanotic nevus, then anterior segment OCT comes very handy. Example is this child, a teenager brought by his physician mother, where there was a fleshy pigmented, non-pigmented lesion with a feeder vessel and some amount of intrinsic deeper vessels, slight amount of encroachment on the corneal epithelium. You can't really pinpoint to the fact that it is a nevus because it's non-pigmented here. And when you do imaging, you find microcyst confirming that it is indeed a amelanotic nevus. And when the lesion transfers from nevus to melanoma, again, it carries the features. This is a patient where this part of the lesion is a nevus, and this is a newly grown component of a nevus, which is melanoma. And when you do UBM here, you find that these are microcysts that you see here, microcysts, which corresponds to the area where there is microcyst on histopathology as well. This is the nevus, and this is the watershed zone where the solid component is melanoma. So you can clinically detect if a particular nevus has transformed to a melanoma in a doubtful situation. Of course, for OSS and clinical criteria are the ones with which you diagnose it. But if you have any diagnostic dilemma at all, then you can bring in anterior segment OCT, which the features of which were very well described by Dr. Carol Karp, where you find that this is a normal epithelium, which is grayish and about 60-70 micron thick. If the epithelium is hyperplastic, and as opposed to gray epithelium, if it is hyper-reflective, ending with a nice blunt snout, that is very characteristic of OSSN. So if you have a simulating conjunctival lesion, it may look like pterygium up, pterygium pingicula, etc. But if it has these features, hyperplastic, hyperreflective corneal epithelium ending with a snout, then you tend to diagnose it as OSSN. It will also tell you about the base of the lesion. Margins are something that are easy to diagnose. Like this patient has very crisp margin, which is stained with rose bengal. You know, this is a margin. But what about the base itself? Slit lamp sometimes is inadequate to detect the base. So if you do anterior segment imaging, you find that this particular lesion is confined to conjunctiva, and this is bubbly tenons underneath it. So your plane of dissection can be subtenons here with a margin of safety. This is a patient where there is corneal OSS, and so until we do an imaging, we won't know whether the corneal involvement is full thickness stromal, as you see here. This is the normal corneal thickness, and this is the splayed thickened stroma. There he has full thickness corneal stromal involvement, thus needing either penetrating keratoplasty or plaque brachytherapy. For patients with anterior segment invasion, these 4 patients, you can never clinically say whether they have anterior segment invasion or not, because you can't see behind the iris. And sometimes you cannot do gonioscopy because the lesion is right on top there. So you can do imaging to confirm whether there is anterior segment invasion already. OCT angiography can help you visualize layer by layer vascularity of the conjunctiva, and then there is this software-based remodeling where you can get 360-degree view of the conjunctival vascularity, which may help you predict early recurrences, clinically undetectable areas of early recurrence, especially if you have treated these patients conservatively without surgery. Let's go to management. The first mode of management is topical or local chemotherapy, where we can either use chemotherapeutic drugs such as mitomycin or 5-fluorouracil, or use immunotherapy, which is interferon alpha 2b. Let's look at some of the indications. Before that, cost comparison. Well, 5-FU is the cheapest. Mitomycin and interferon cost almost the same. Interferon has some availability issues in some parts of the country. The major difference is that mitomycin works definitely better, it works faster and better, but it has a lot of ocular surface issues, ocular surface complications. So in terms of tolerance, mitomycin is the worst. In terms of tolerance, interferon is the best. It has very mild effect on the ocular surface, so patients tolerate it very well, but interferon is very slow to work. So somewhere in between is 5-fluorouracil, which is moderately effective and moderately toxic. So if you have a choice between 5-FU and mitomycin, you can choose 5-fluorouracil in a patient who is not tolerant to mitomycin, or if you think the patient is going to be compliant for a prolonged haul, that is 3 to 4 months it takes for interferon to work, then interferon is good. So either which way, these are the 3 drugs which are classic, time tested and effective. So when you do these treatments, there are 3 ways you can use them. One is for complete tumor control, which is called immunotherapy or chemotherapy. When you want to simply reduce the size of the lesion and the residual part of the lesion you want to take care of by surgery, that is called immunoreduction or chemoreduction. When you want to enhance the immune system so that the patient does not have multiple episodes of local tumor recurrence, that's called immunomodulation. There you give once a day dose of interferon for a very long time, specifically in patients who have a high chance of local tumor recurrence, such as xeroderma pigmentosum patients or patients with HIV seropositivity or organ transplant associated immunosuppression. So these are the 3 ways of giving treatment. Let's look at some of the patients for indications for immunotherapy. If you have a small lesion of this sort, patient who has a lesion which is say 1 or 2 clock hours, very small lesion, where you simply don't want to do surgery, and if you have time for 6 to 8 weeks, you can treat them with topical therapy and it goes away. One more example of a smaller lesion, which is about 1.5 clock hours, gone away, leaving a residual actinic keratosis, which was the precursor of the lesion. Of course, that doesn't change, and the rest of the lesion has gone away. So these are all patients who have been treated with topical therapy, very small lesions, 1 to 2 clock hours, flattish, and they do well. One more example of a small lesion gone away with topical therapy. That's one indication, small lesions. Second, and the most important indication is when there is corneal epithelial invasion. This is a very nice picture where the cornea specialist has done a biopsy here, after which he has sent the patient over for consultation. Now, rest of the tumor has been treated with topical therapy. This is after a few days after starting topical therapy. This is after a few weeks, and this is after a few years. So what you notice is that there is subtle corneal scar exactly in the area where biopsy has been performed. So what it means is that if you were to try to do excision in this patient primarily, you may have possibly caused some corneal scar in the pupillary axis, thus precluding 20/20 and 6 vision. So in a patient who has corneal involvement of OSSN, where the epithelium is involved, it's not really stromal disease, and it involves a visual axis like this. So very ideal indication for topical therapy. This is an example of a patient where penetrating keratoplasty has been done. This is a patient with xeroderma pigmentosum where, because of corneal scar, keratoplasty has been done. And this is a precious graft for the patient. It is a failed graft, after which a regraft has been done. And unluckily, at the graft host junction, the patient has developed a OSSN, which xeroderma pigmentosum patients are anyway prone to develop. Now, this patient, if you were to do surgery, you may induce graft rejection or graft failure. So short of that, when you treat them with topical therapy, you can see that the lesion completely gone. So this is one indication. Difficult situations where you cannot do surgery, where you can rely on topical therapy. The third indication is lesion which are involving more than 6 clock hours of the limbus. Well, these can be excised, especially with simple limbal epithelial transplantation that you can combine it with. But generally, if a patient has more than 6 clock hours of limbal involvement, then there is a slightly higher chance of limbal stem cell deficiency and conjunctivalization of the cornea. To avoid that, for a flatter lesion like this, you can definitely use topical therapy, and that's scarless healing. There's hardly any scar in that area, and the limbal integrity is maintained following regression. On a diffuse lesion like this, diffuse is when the thickness of the lesion is less than 20% of the basal diameter of the lesion, or if the lesion involves more than 6 clock hours of the ocular surface. This patient has a larger lesion involving about 7 to 8 clock hours of ocular surface, and interferon works very well in flat lesions. Like if a patient has a flat lesion, interferon works very well. If a patient has a large elevated lesion, then interferon may not work so well. Mitomycin may work in giant nodular lesions. One more example of a diffuse tumor, but this patient unfortunately has almost the entire ocular surface involved by the tumor. The bulbar conjunctiva, palpebral conjunctiva, this is a clear-cut case for orbital exentration. Now here in this patient, with the other eye being non-seeing in this patient, we had to do something more conservative. And after doing map biopsy, confirming the extent of the tumor, we started this patient on injection interferon, 3 million international units. He received 6 injections followed by topical therapy, and he's doing pretty well after several years. So all of them do not respond so well. It's like a 50-50 chance. In such situations, injection interferon may work in half the patients, and in half the patients, you may still have to do extensive surgery or orbital excision. HIV positive patient with palpable conjunctival, pharyngeal, and bulbar conjunctival involvement, again responding very well to injection interferon. So injection interferon is used in 2 sets of patients. One, if a patient is non-compliant to therapy, or if you assess the patient and appears to be non-compliant to therapy, you can give injection 3 weekly. Or if a patient has a larger diffuse lesion, then injections work much better than topical medication. Next issue is about immunoreduction. For a patient who has a slightly larger lesion, where you can excise, of course, but with a lot of ocular surface reconstruction, if you want to reduce it in size, then you can use topical therapy. So this larger lesion has reduced to this smaller lesion on topical therapy. So how do you explain that? For example, if this is the limbus and this is the tumor, the epicenter of the tumor, and this is the complete extent of the tumor. Let's assume that this was the epicenter of the tumor. That generally happens to be invasive squamous cell carcinoma. Topical therapy does not work well on invasive squamous cell carcinoma, but surrounding it would be zones of carcinoma in situ, mild, moderate, and severe dysplasia. Then topical therapy takes care of all those areas, and what is left is just this invasive squamous cell carcinoma component for you to excise. So lesson here is that topical therapy works very well on dysplasia and carcinoma in situ, leaving part of the invasive squamous cell carcinoma to be taken care of by surgery. So your extent of surgery is much less. Immunomodulation is for patients, as I said, xeroderma pigmentosa and HIV patients who tend to recur, have multifocality. There you want to modulate their ocular surface immunity by using topical therapy. It is said that you have to differentiate from HPV-mediated OSSN versus actinic damage-mediated OSSN. We cannot clinically, and there are no good tools currently, even PCR-based diagnostics, to say that a particular patient has HPV-mediated OSSN or it is actinic keratosis mediated or actinic damage mediated OSSN. But in patients with immunocompromised status, it is said to be HPV, human papillomavirus mediated infection, whereas xeroderma pigmentosa patients, you can either have HPV mediated or actinic damage mediated. So you really don't know, but in both the situations, somehow interferon used as an immunomodulator on ocular surface on once a day dose seems to be working well. So the differences between topical advantages and disadvantages are that topical therapy is definitely non-invasive, apparently reduces the incidence of limbal stem cell deficiency, produces scarless healing, but it is expensive in the long run. If you have to use interferon for 6 months, it's almost more than the cost of one-time surgery. And the patient has to be very compliant, and you'll never have histopathology evidence. So these are the disadvantages. Now, topical therapy, to repeat what I said, corneal OSSN, diffuse placoid lesion, compliant patients accessible for follow-up, adjuvant therapy for edge involvement, etc., and for chemoreduction is useful. Whereas for invasive squamous cell carcinoma, or when patients have lesions where you're unsure of the depth despite imaging, where there is a localized nodular tumor, intolerance to topical therapy, and poor compliance anticipated, then you do surgery. Now, when you talk about surgery, you talk about excision with tumor-free margins. Now, how do you determine the tumor-free margin? But a very good slit lamp evaluation associated with staining, either with rose bengal or any other vital stain, specifically for squamous neoplasias. Staining doesn't work well for pigmented lesions. So staining is important for squamous neoplasias, with which you know subclinical margins as well, and beyond that 4 millimeter margin. Then for the corneal epithelial component, use what is called alcohol-assisted keratoepitheliectomy. Lamellar keratectomy, generally you don't perform, rather do plaque brachytherapy for the residual, unless you know that it is very superficially involving the corneal stoma and you can get away with a superficial keratectomy. Lamellar sclerectomy can be performed if sclera is involved in a localized fashion. Cryotherapy to the resection edge is mandatory. Every patient who undergoes excision has to undergo cryotherapy to the conjunctival resection edge, not to the corneal resection edge. And base cryotherapy is only when during surgery you discover that 1 or 2 clock hours of the limbus may be slightly deeper involved. So pending pathology report, it's a good idea to cryo that particular part of the base. These are the kind of drawings that you want to draw for complex lesions, where you map out every part of the lesion, have a surgical plan, and take it to the OT. Let me show you a video clip of a simple excision of a small conjunctival ocular surface chemistry neoplasia. Small or big, the principles remain the same. You identify the margin, clinically clear margin. Beyond that, you mark 4 millimeter, and then you incise the edge. Never hold the tumor itself, always hold normal conjunctiva around it, and try to be as little manipulative during surgery as possible. We're using RF electrode, which is good, but you can also use scissors and blade. That's the dissection of the base under visualization. Then as you reach the limbus, if there are exuberant blood vessels there, you can cauterize them. Dry the cornea and apply absolute alcohol for about 15, 20, 30 seconds till the corneal epithelium turns subtle gray. Then the epithelium loosens, you know that, and you simply have to scroll the corneal epithelium to reach the limbus from the corneal side. You have already reached the limbus from the conjunctival side. This scrolls off the Bowman's membrane very easily without damaging the Bowman's membrane itself, which is a very good barrier for tumor getting into the stroma. So you have to be very gentle and scroll it off till we reach the limbus from the corneal side. Then you do a superficial lumbectomy, all under visualization. Some surgeons believe in dry technique, but I believe nothing is dry, because if you don't squirt saline, then blood will make it wet anyway, and you won't even be able to see the base. So I'd rather have a wet field where I can visualize, and that's the reverse cryo, where I drape the conjunctiva on top of a 3 millimeter large cryoprobe and cryo the entire conjunctival edge twice over. This is called double freeze thaw cryotherapy with spontaneous thawing all around, done twice over. This gives you additional 3 to 4 millimeter clearance over the margins that you already taken. Since during surgery we thought that the limbus was slightly deeply involved in this particular clock cover, we are doing base cryotherapy also, pending histopathology, of course. Pathologists will also confirm the clock cover where the base may be positive. So once you've done all this, you have to repair the conjunctiva. You can use a conjunctival autograft or simply put in an amniotic membrane, either sutured or glued. It's your choice. Glued is always good because patients are very tolerant to glue rather than to sutures. Either which way, anyway, conjunctiva heals very well, and by 6 weeks, they're all good to go. This is an example of a larger lesion treated with excision. Now, excision can also be based on intraoperative OCT, which is supposed to be very useful, but the accuracy of intraorbital OCT in terms of image resolution is not so good. So finally, you have to depend a lot on your preoperative OCT and also your intraoperative clinical observation to determine the base, and finally wait for the pathologist to tell you that it's all clear. Now, what is the role of primary simple limbal epithelial transplantation? We have been doing it more often than earlier now, especially if there is an indication. So my indication is that if there is extensive limbal involvement and or you have done radiotherapy, plaque brachytherapy, then you using primary simple limbal epithelial transplantation may help have a better ocular surface and have patient to have better visual acuity, because the chance of limbal stem cell deficiency and conjunctivalization of the cornea and need for secondary surgery for that purpose will be much less. Surgery does remain an excellent option. Now, what are the indications for adjuvant therapy following surgery? This is the protocol that we have. If the resection edge is positive on histopathology and it has only dysplasia or carcinoma in situ, and you've already done cryotherapy, then you do nothing, you observe. That's the advantage of cryotherapy. Resection edges can come positive, unfortunately, and if you've already done cryotherapy, you have to do nothing. If you have not done cryotherapy, then you can do topical chemotherapy or immunotherapy, because carcinoma in situ and dysplasia respond to topical therapy. If resection edge is positive and the pathologist tells you that there is invasive squamous cell carcinoma, then medico-legally you are bound to re-excise, because we know that invasive squamous cell carcinoma does not respond to topical therapy, or if it's a melanoma that you're dealing with. If the resection base is positive and the pathologist is able to tell you that, okay, 1 clock hour is involved and that's 4 o'clock, then you can definitely go ahead and do cryotherapy. If the resection base is positive, but the pathologist is not able to tell you what is the location of base positivity, or if it is diffuse, then you can't go ahead and do scleral excision, but you can easily do plaque brachytherapy. Then immunomodulation, we already talked. That is the indication for adjuvant therapy. Now, there are certain difficult sets of patients which are beyond surgery, like patients who have scleral invasion up front. There we do plaque brachytherapy. Plaque can be done in 2 ways. One is secondary plaque brachytherapy, where you excise the tumor in flush with the sclera or take about 10-20% of scleral thickness, wait for the pathology, histopathology, to confirm the base involvement and the diagnosis, and wait for the ocular surface to resurface 3 to 4 weeks. You'd already put in an AMG and then do cryotherapy, then do plaque brachytherapy. That is called secondary plaque brachytherapy, guided by histopathology. Like all these patients have undergone secondary plaque brachytherapy and they're doing fine. We already know that they have scleral involvement, but you still wait for the pathologist to confirm, because sometimes it may not be OSSN, it may be mucoepidermoid variant of OSSN, things like that. So it's one way of doing it. But the current trend is to do what is called primary plaque brachytherapy. Now, primary plaque brachytherapy can be done in 2 ways. One is that you don't excise the tumor at all, place it right on top of the tumor, where the cornea is already melted, and if you were to do surgery, tectonic integrity may be lost. You do a small biopsy, confirm the diagnosis, and you can place the plaque right on top of the tumor. Or you can excise it, and without waiting for pathology, just based on your OCT information that it is a stromal involvement or scleral involvement, then you can place the plaque. That is also called primary plaque brachytherapy. In any case, plaque is very highly effective with eye salvage rates of over 90%. So some examples of whether we can save advanced cases. This patient, a young individual with reasonable vision earlier, multiple excisions, and has intraocular extension. You can see that he has choroidal invasion already. So earlier we would enucleate such patients. Now that's the retinal detachment that he has. Here because the patient was not keen on enucleation at all, we chose stereotactic radiation, and you can see that he has responded. That's the MRI scan, and that's the field of radiation that we chose to give, and see how nicely he has responded. His retinal detachment is gone, his scleral invasion is gone, his choroidal invasion is gone. So stereotactic radiation can help. This patient was given chemoradiation, actually, concurrent 5-fluorouracil and radiation work very beautifully for him. And even on UBM, you can see that it's all gone. So this is one situation where we could salvage. Another situation where we could salvage is when the extraocular muscles are involved by the tumor. So if the extraocular muscle is involved, you can do plaque brachytherapy on top of it. Like this patient with melanoma with multiple excisions elsewhere. Let me see if this video plays. Yeah. Right. So this is a patient where there is extraocular muscle involvement also. I hope that part is captured in the clip. Anyway, so we are excising the lesion. This has PAM component also. We excise the part of the melanoma, and PAM, the muzzle has been hooked, and tumor has been removed. And you can see that the muzzle which was involved is also removed. So that information we get from the MRI, fornices are checked. That is alcohol-assisted keratoepithelectomy and removal of pigmented areas. The muzzle is put back in its position after the stump has been excised, and the plaque is placed on the bed of the tumor, and then we rotate it to cover the insertion of the extraocular muscle. That is the rotation on subsequent occasion, say within 18 or 24 hours, as soon as the dosimetry related exposure time is over. Then you cryo the base and cover the ocular surface with amniotic membrane. So that was an extensive surgery where plaque was rotated 3 times, and symblepharon ring would be mandatory, and a tarsorrhaphy is mandatory in such patients. But the gratifying fact is that they do very well. You don't have to do exentration in diffuse melanoma. You can actually treat them with surgery. The same patient after several months doing very well without any trace of recurrence. Last bit is about some newer advances such as vaporization. Like patients who have lymphangioma, you can give bleomycin, but anterior lesions, bleomycin is slightly tricky because You may have corneal epithelial toxicity. You can simply vaporize them using RF electrode. Works better than carbon dioxide laser. Extensive lymphangioma of the ocular surface, again vaporized with multiple sessions of RF, and this conjunctival scar, of course, can be excised and ocular surface resurfaced. Last bit is about target therapy for ocular surface tumors. This is a patient where there is a lymphoproliferative lesion, lymphoma, and what we can excise is the anterior component of it. The lesion has gone along the eyeball between the SRLPS complex there, hugging the eyeball. So that part is difficult to excise. Only option is after excision of the anterior component to give radiation to the residual. Well, if you don't want to give radiation and you know that it is mild lymphoma on histopathology and you want to be minimally invasive, then you can give rituximab injection. Perilesional rituximab 5 milligram per ml is the dose that is used, and mild lymphoma responds very well to 3 weekly injections of rituximab. Now, for melanoma specifically, mutational spectrum has all been worked out, and you have specific target therapy for each of these mutations. And reports have started appearing in the literature about the use of various target therapy agents. This was a patient when nivolumab was given for his lymph node metastasis, whereas he also has conjunctival tumor recurrence. And after 3 months, his conjunctival tumor recurrence has disappeared. So this could come as a primary therapy. Of course, it's expensive currently, at least in patients where you want to avoid drastic measures such as orbital excentrations. So I would say that the management of ocular surface neoplasia is extremely simple. It is strategy that is more important than the technique. Technique is very, very simple. You have to apply a particular therapeutic strategy and a protocol to a given patient or customize it, and then do surgery based on that protocol or apply all therapeutic modalities based on that protocol. Imaging, target therapy, and innovative use of plaque brachytherapy always help. And we have definitely improved the outcome in such patients by using a combination of treatment rather than relying on just one. Thank you so much. Has Raksha joined? Raksha, are you there? Apparently, she's not joined. So, Khairuz, do you have any cases to show till she joins? Or Vikas?
I will just,
So,
Yeah, Vikas, you can.
Dr. Vikas, go ahead.
I'll just see. I'm just checking. Just give me one.
Yeah.
minute.
Any questions in the
So
meanwhile?
yeah, we can
Anybody else?
discuss. I mean, I have a question for you, sir. Like, how you cauterize the lymphangioma. This is for the viewers, in fact, benefit of viewers. So is there you use radio frequency cautery, I hope?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is there a
RFL.
particular power that you use, for the
Right.
radio
Power is
frequency cautery?
tailored.
And what are
Actually,
the
what I do is
precautions that you have to take?
right.
Sir?
So I put a viscoelastic agent to protect the cornea.
Okay.
Then I use the A10 electrode, which is a longer electrode, which has the regular electrode, and not use the tip, but the side of it. Side of it very gradually over the surface of the lesion, and you observe.
Sorry, sir, the straight tipped one, not the round ones or the straight.
Correct. Straight tipped one, but to use the side of the electrode, side, not the tip. You understood, right? So side of the electrode, we start, on the surface of the lesion, and you see the vaporization effect on microscope that the thickness of the lesion is gradually reducing, and you start seeing fumes. It should not be so high that it will char and burn. It should be only high that it should vaporize. So you titrate it. Sometimes you have to go on, at least in the Pelave model that I have, I set it to 12 or 18. And then it takes about 5 to 6 minutes for you to completely vaporize the lesion. And when you do that, there is hardly any bleeding because RF also is hemostatic, right?
Yes.
So that's an additional advantage. And if you have a larger area to denude, then you can always do a primary amniotic membrane transplantation at the same time.
Okay. Okay.
Do you use the blend setting or the just hemostatic?
I use the blend setting.
Sorry?
Both cut and coact.
Blend setting, yeah. So there are a few questions in the chat box also. One of the questions earlier that I typed the message
Was
was this was about the caruncular melanomas. So what is your
Okay.
approach to managing caruncular melanomas? I just answered with what I was practicing, but I would like to know what is your opinion about caruncular melanomas.
They're supposed to be deeper and more aggressive, but if you know the depth already, then there is no point exaggerating them or anything of that sort. I know there are certain cases in the literature where exenteration has been performed or following excision they have recurred, but I still favor giving them a chance with excision. But you have to get the clear margins. Conjunctival tumors, it's slightly difficult to get frozen section, but for caruncle, since the firmer tissue, you can always get frozen section if you have any doubt at all, especially the base, because you can't do plaque brachytherapy to the base if it's a caruncular lesion. MRI is a very good tool. Surface coil MRI can tell you how deep is the lesion. And if you can't get enough idea with MRI, then you might want to do it at frozen section margin cut, base cut.
Only problem is medially it is difficult to get a clear margin in caruncular tumors. So what I do is I excise as much as possible of the clear margin I can take on either side. Medially, of course, there is enough tissue available. Laterally, there is enough tissue available, but medially I go as much as I can take and then do extensive heavy cryotherapy to all the remaining structures.
Correct.
I feel that, these are extensive lesions, and if you try to exenterate also these lesions, unless they are going deep into the orbit, the life survival is not going to change for these patients, even with mutilating surgery.
Absolutely no. No, exenteration has no benefit in life salvage, and you can run over to the skin also. I mean, if it is right up to the medial canthus, then you can excise a bit of skin, 3 to 4 millimeter of skin, and repair it, and you don't have to really worry about the lacrimal system.
Yeah.
Okay, if you have to sacrifice the canaliculus, you can still do that.
There is another question in the chat box as to how do we know the endpoint of interferon therapy? Is visible clinical regression sufficient, or do we go in for a biopsy?
Well, you never do biopsy. It's always visible clinical regression, slit lamp plus staining. And if at all you have any doubt at all, you can do OCT. That's it. And beyond complete clinical regression, you give 6 more weeks of interferon without any tapering. You don't taper interferon or mitomycin. You give it as per the schedule 4 times a day and stop it at the end of 6 weeks following complete clinical regression.
Another question is, what is the time limit to know if interferon therapy is working for a patient or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. Interferon sometimes does not work. So I would say if you have a good photo documentation, 6 weeks is a good time to say whether it is reduced in size. Sometimes what happens is the size may not actually reduce so much in 6 weeks, but the vascularity reduces. It becomes very pale, intrinsic vascularity reduces, thickness reduces, but the width may remain the same. So you still can continue on topical therapy. So if interferon does not work, you can shift over to 5-FU or mitomycin, and vice versa also. There are situations where 5-FU or mitomycin do not work, but when you start them on interferon, it works. So there is switchover always possible.
So did you mean 6 weeks or 6 months with interferon?
6 weeks. 6 weeks. To say it is not working. 6
Okay.
months is a bit too long, right?
So, but then probably 3 sessions, like, do you get a lot of change in the first cycle itself with topical interferon?
Yeah, first interferon we give continuously. We don't stop it in between.
Correct.
4 times a day continuously.
Correct.
And yeah,
But the evaluation is usually monthly, no, sir? 4 weekly, no?
no.
The follow-up of these patients, when do you do? When you start?
6 weeks.
Okay.
You call them at 6 weeks. Unless you have to inject them, you call at 3 weeks. When they come at 6 weeks, so if the first response is at 6 weeks, if you don't see any response at 6 weeks, even if I have continued, I haven't found that they have responded. Either they needed surgery or they needed mitomycin. So 6 weeks is my cutoff to say whether they have responded or not. If they haven't responded, there could be many reasons. One is that they may not have prepared interferon well, right? Or they may have got a spurious brand, or they may not have preserved it well. But the first time when you do it, you always do it yourself and give it to them. At least for the first 3 to 4 weeks, they would have used what you have prepared from your own hospital stores, so which you trust. So it is the first time that you give interferon that you believe that you've given them the right thing, and then still if it doesn't respond, then possibly it is not going to respond.
Sir, has it ever happened that, a patient not responding to topical eye drops of interferon has responded to injectable subconjunctival injections?
Yes, yes, that has happened. That is known. Even Dr. Karp has similar examples. And now, after the initial enthusiasm with interferon, it's died down in the US. Earlier, there was a peak of interferon where about 80% of treating ophthalmology shifted over to interferon from mitomycin. But now the response rate is lower. Overall response rate now has dropped down to about 60 to 70% only with long-term data. So they have shifted back to mitomycin or 5-fluorouracil.
Can we increase the concentration of the drops? Because you see 3 million international units is working subconjunctively for these patients, and we are using, just a suggestion that has anybody tried that? We are using 1 million in international
There is a
units.
paper.
So,
There's a study.
so
Doesn't
Yeah,
really
there is
matter.
a study where they have compared by Dr. Carol Cup with 1 million international unit and 3 million international unit.
okay.
They
No
found similar outcome with both, and that's why 1 million international unit came into practice
Yeah.
and not 3 million international unit.
So currently, what is your preferred medication for topical therapy? Is it 5-FU or is it interferon?
Interferon. I always start with interferon, and depending on the response, I switch over.
Thank you, sir.
So can
So
I ask
anybody-
one question in between? And Dr. Vikas is sharing the slide. No, so regarding the plaque brachytherapy in OSSN. So if you find a very diffuse lesion, which is, clinically invasive, would you straight away go for a primary plaque brachytherapy rather than, excising it and then waiting for the histopathology and then going for a secondary plaque brachytherapy? So what are your clinical indications for plaque brachytherapy?
Well, primary plaque brachytherapy is a tricky situation because it doesn't, fit well on the tumor which is irregular. So you do it only when there is scleral melt or corneal stromal melt, where you find that if you were to try surgery, the patient's ocular integrity may be compromised. There might be a large perforation which you may not be able to take care of. That is the only situation. That happens when somebody has already operated on those patients. Like I saw a patient where somebody used mitomycin C after partial excision, intraoperative, and the patient had scleral melt. So how can you do anything else except primary plaque brachytherapy where you can see the tumor already there with scleral melt, right? So those are the situations where you do primary in the sense without surgery. But when you do surgery, you can always do plaque brachytherapy at the same session rather than waiting for 3 weeks for the pathology report. When you actually see that the scleral lamella are involved, dose doesn't really matter because for the sclera, you give 2 millimeter plus 1 millimeter margin. So you would have already got the dosimetry by your radiation oncologist for 2 millimeter. Suppose you have left little more tumor on the sclera, or if you have to use it on top of an extraocular muscle, you can always go back to them and ask them to give a dosimetry for 4 millimeter, but you have already applied the plaque, right? And retrospectively, you can get an additional dosage for 4 millimeter because you have placed it on top of the insertion of the lateral rectus. So that is always possible.
So does a raw surface of excision, does a plaque brachytherapy affect a raw surface? Because usually we excise, wait for a few weeks and then.
No, that is what I used to teach earlier. No. It doesn't really matter. And in fact, the plaqued ones have the best unscarred ocular surface because radiation is also antifibrotic.
Okay. So intraoperative after excision also, if there is an invasive suspicion, plaque brachytherapy can be done. Thank you,
right.
sir.
So what is new and what is really coming up is the BRC is trying to make a conformer plaque, which we always used to salivate for,
Dream of, yes.
Yeah, that is one. And strontium is coming in a lower dose where it is not going to cause scleral melt, etc. So if you have a small scleral invasion intraoperatively, you simply apply strontium, and strontium is something that you can pass on to your grandchildren also if they become ocular oncologists because it's forever strontium. Yeah.
So, sir, in these cases with surface tumors where you excise the tumor, let's say we are trying to do a plaque therapy at the time of excision only, preoperatively we had the evidence of a scleral invasion on OCT or something. So there you apply the plaque and you leave it bare, because for other indications we used to cover the plaque with conjunctiva always. We tried to cover
Yeah,
it.
we stopped that. We applied directly over the sclera, leave it bare, and when you remove the plaque, you put an amniotic membrane. Like you saw in the melanoma patient, we rotated plaque thrice on that patient, and at the final rotation, we put an amniotic membrane. So that's how it is.
Cryotherapy is done in the initial sitting only, but the amniotic membrane is put after the plaque is removed.
Correct. Any other question? I think chat, we have some questions. Same ones, right?
Another question earlier was, which I earlier answered, was that how do you differentiate a small amelanotic nevus from Axenfeld loop? So basically, Axenfeld loops would be a little deeper at a deeper level and subconjunctival, whereas a amelanotic nevus would be a conjunctival lesion. Would you like to add anything else to it?
The vessels, the piercing of the vessels also, Dr. Vikas, in an Axenfeld loop, you will find the vessels coming out over there and the pigmentation around it.
And they don't need to be treated. One question was, do you need to treat them or excise them? So obviously not.
No, not at all. We are run out of time, just 1 minute left. So thank all of you. This is, I think, the 5th year in succession that we are having this course.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you so much. We learned
Thank
a
you
lot.
very much, sir. Thank you so
always
much.
as part of this course.
Take
Yeah,
care.
we learn every time there is a new learning.
Yeah, every time. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Himay.
Thank you, Himay. You are a good host. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santosh.
Thank you, Himay.
Dr. Vikas Menon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Feroz.
Thank you.
I hope you had a very informative and a